So, thank you once again, Firaz, Dr. Adil, and Aiza for having me in today's session as the moderator. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Tong Zhao, who is going to speak today on US-China military competition, implications for regional and global security. The topic in its own right is very important considering how US-China competition has for over the past few years has transformed into a rather more aggressive, has taken a more rather aggressive shape, and how things are turning out to be in not only in the Indo-Pacific region, but also the impact of the Ukrainian war and how the situation in Europe is going to impact the rest of the equation in the Indo-Pacific region as well. So Dr. Tong Zhao is a senior fellow in the nuclear policy program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a visiting research scholar at the program on science and global security at Princeton University. He conducts research on strategic security issues such as nuclear weapons policy, deterrence, arms control, non-proliferation, nuclear missile defense, hypersonic weapons, and China security and foreign policy. He is an associate editor of the Journal of Science and Global Security and is a member of the International Panel on Fissile Material and also serves as the board of director on the Asia Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. And he is also on advisory board of the Missile Defense Initiative. With that, the list is long, but I think these are some of the key achievements that indicate his expertise, not only on just the subject, but I think the related issues such as the growing arms race in the region, the risks of nuclear weapons in the region, and so on and so forth. So I give it to you, Dom, to take it from now. And you have about 40 to 45 minutes for your initial remarks, the areas you want to talk about, in particular with regards to US-China growing competition. And this will be followed up by an interactive session. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Tara, for the very kind introduction. I also very much appreciate the kind invitation to be here. It's great to meet with all of you virtually. I think I'll start my presentation with an introduction about why we have seen some really impressive military development in China, especially in the domain of strategic capabilities like nuclear, space technologies, etc. I think first reason is under current Chinese paramount leader, the strategic military capabilities are viewed as very important for upholding and strengthening China's international status. President Xi, when he came into power, he came into power, he proposed this very important slogan to achieve the Chinese dream of a strong military. I think in his mind, for China to become a powerful country and respected country in the international community, it is inevitable that China also has to develop a very strong and modern capable military power. And he especially has been saying publicly that the nuclear, the missile forces of China are a key pillar for China's international status. So I think it is not surprising that under his watch, China has invested even more heavily into the modernization of strategic military capabilities, especially nuclear capabilities. A second reason, which is even more important, is that China thinks that the shifting balance of power in the international system is making Western countries behave more aggressively against China and adopt more hostile policies against China. We know that there have been growing tensions between China and the US-led Western countries. And China thinks the reason behind these rising tensions is that China's successful development has been increasingly challenging the American predominance in the international system. And therefore, the US is using excuses like human rights record in China to contain China's further development and to prevent China's further challenging of American predominance. So that's the Chinese interpretation of what has been happening. And therefore, given the troubles are a result of the shifting balance of power in the international system, then from the Beijing's perspective, the solution has to be that China should further shift the balance of power to its advantage. By the time China can establish a clear power advantage over the United States, the US and the US-led Western countries would have to recognize China's capability and would have to listen to China with respect and treat China more equally and fairly. So there is this very strong power-centric mindset in the Chinese security policy community. And they really think that to further build up China's material power, including military power and nuclear power, is the probably only solution to resolve the current tensions and problems between China and the US-led Western countries. And a third reason, I think, is there is a very serious perception gap between the two sides, which further contributes to China's power-centric mindset. The two sides have increasingly divergent views on some basic factual issues, like what happened in Xinjiang, what happened to the Uyghurs, what happened in Hong Kong. Are there really concentration camps in Xinjiang? And in international issues, they also disagree about some basic facts, like does the US really operate biolabs in Ukraine and other countries to conduct illegal biological weapons research? The vast majority of Chinese experts and Chinese people do believe that this is the case, whereas the US and Western countries dismiss such accusations as disinformation. The two sides also disagree about recent geopolitical issues, like what's the cause of the Ukraine war. Western countries blame Russia for invading another country and violating its sovereignty, whereas China blames the US and NATO for expanding to the east in recent decades and for ignoring the legitimate security interests of Russia. So they have fundamentally opposite and divergent views on a wide range of domestic international issues, including basic factual issues. And therefore, they increasingly cannot talk with each other, but rather talk past each other. They have had high-level dialogues between senior government officials on an increasingly frequent basis, but they do not appear to be able to even reach basic common understandings on even factual issues, so let alone to agree on policy perspectives and the solutions. So not being able to understand each other is a huge problem, and that again reinforces the power-centric thinking, which basically demands China to further focus on power build-up, so that the there's less hope to resolve bilateral problems through dialogues and communications. The hope is that the problems would somehow automatically be resolved if the power balance can be further shifted. And this power-centric mindset manifests in many areas, but especially in the military domain and especially in the nuclear domain. Because I'm a specialist in nuclear policy research, so I will tend to focus a little bit on the nuclear relationship. And in this regard, I think for decades, China had maintained a very modest nuclear capability and had adopted a very modest nuclear posture. I think the primary goal of Chinese nuclear weapons for the past decades had been to basically promote nuclear stability with its nuclear rivals, especially the United States. Right? The goal is to ensure China had a credible second strike capability to deter any nuclear attack or threat of nuclear attack by the United States and other nuclear rivals. But I think in recent years, the objective has shifted a little bit from maintaining nuclear stability to also help maintain political stability. As I said, China believes that the US-led Western countries are becoming much more politically hostile against China and directly targeting Chinese ruling party and trying to drive a wedge between CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and the Chinese people. They believe that the US-led Western countries are more interested in promoting regime change in Beijing. So they present a much higher level political threat to China's regime security and political security. So I think increasingly, China is making efforts to use nuclear weapons to help ensure stability between the two sides at the political level, in addition to at the nuclear level. If we look at the trajectory of China's nuclear capability for many decades, it is believed, based on open source research, that China had maintained an arsenal of about 200 nuclear weapons. But in recent years, the number has been quickly growing. Today, according to, again, open source research, China appears to have about 350 nuclear weapons. And according to assessments of the US Department of Defense, that number could grow to up to 700 by 2027 in 5 years, and could grow to at least 1,000 by 2030, the end of this decade. So there is this very abrupt and fast acceleration of China's nuclear development. And we have seen news reports based on research conducted by international experts using commercial satellite imagery to show that China appears to be building at least 3 major silo sites for potential deployment of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. And there are currently more than 300 ICBM silos under construction. If you look at this development from the Chinese perspective, it's not that surprising, because China is really good at conducting large-scale infrastructure building at relatively affordable prices, and having these large numbers of ICBMs deployed together also gives China the opportunity to build very robust and reliable ground-based nuclear command control systems, and offer China the capability to use its theater range or terminal phase missile defense systems to protect these ICBM silos. And at the official level, China is also shifting away from its traditional policy. China used to really criticize the United States and Russia for building and maintaining a nuclear triad capability. But today, China officially is advocating for and promoting its own development of a nuclear triad capability. In addition to the construction of nuclear silos, China is also expanding its road mobile ICBM forces. Mr. Xi has directed Chinese military to massively expand China's sea-based nuclear deterrent capabilities, i.e. SSBNs. And China is also strengthening its airborne nuclear capabilities. So it's a full-fledged effort to expand nuclear triad. And in terms of the nuclear posture, there is also some important changes underway. The PLA rocket force increasingly emphasizes the importance of rapid response capabilities. There appears growing interest in the military to develop the capability to conduct launch under attack operations. There's growing cooperation with Russia to build early warning systems and missile defense collaboration between the two. China, of course, is well known for developing and deploying in large numbers of so-called dual-capable missile systems. Its BF-26 missile, for example, is reportedly capable of being armed with either a nuclear or conventional warhead and can conduct a hot swap of warheads on the battlefield. All of these changes in its nuclear posture from emphasizing rapid response capability, having a portion of Chinese nuclear forces on higher level of alert during peacetime, building a capability to conduct launch under attack, deploying large numbers of dual-capable missiles. All of these could introduce a higher risk of inadvertent escalation in a crisis. But because the focus right now is on further strengthening Chinese overall nuclear capability to achieve better political level stability, so naturally there is less attention paid to the implications for crisis stability right now. Despite these potential risk of more intensive nuclear competition between China and the United States, to conduct arms control talks between the two sides is going to be challenging, not least because of the very strong power-centric mindset, which means the majority of Chinese experts believe that it is time for China to focus on building up its nuclear power rather than to restrain Chinese power expansion potential. So there does not appear to be a lot of political interest in arms control discussion with the United States. Even risk reduction cooperation may be difficult, even though it is widely regarded as the low-hanging fruit for the two sides to grab. Because the two sides attribute the sources, the risks, the military risks, nuclear risks to different sources. And China believes that it is the American military posture, including conducting close-range reconnaissance and surveillance activities by American aircrafts and military ships near the Chinese shore. That's the real source for raising the risk of military incident between the two sides. So if U.S. really wants to reduce risk, it has to stop its current military operations, including surveillance operations near Chinese airspace and the coast. But the U.S. Prefer to talk about technical level measures that can reduce nuclear risk, including increasing decision-making time, ensuring timely communication between the leaders in a crisis, focusing on highly survivable nuclear systems, reducing the reliance on launch under attack postures, etc. So the two sides are not on the same page, even in terms of how to promote risk reduction. So it is unlikely they will make major progress in that regard. Another major obstacle for bilateral arms control talk is the power asymmetry between the two sides. There is a very strong belief in the Chinese policy community that it is impossible for China to engage in equal negotiation with the United States, which has a much stronger nuclear capability. The stronger side will, for sure, use its greater capability as a leverage to force the weaker side accept unfair and unequal negotiation results. So China shouldn't and couldn't engage in arms control talks with the United States when there's such capability gap between the two sides. There is also, I think, a relative lack of expertise on the Chinese side, especially on issues of arms control. China has not conducted bilateral or multilateral nuclear arms control agreements with any party. Its experts are not as familiar with issues like verification procedures and technologies as American experts and Russian experts. So it is not surprising that many Chinese experts have a natural suspicion about whether verification can work to provide high enough confidence that it would deter, especially the stronger party, from violating its responsibilities, and whether it is possible to come up with verification measures that are not too intrusive to infringe on the security interests of the weaker party. Technological development is another challenge. Today, a major difference between the Cold War era nuclear landscape and today is that during the Cold War, nuclear weapons were mostly vulnerable to nuclear threats. But today, nuclear weapons are increasingly vulnerable, at least in theory, to a wide range of non-nuclear military technologies, including missile defense, conventional precision strike weapons, unmanned weapon systems, space-based remote sensors, even AI technologies and cyber capabilities that can potentially infiltrate into enemy's nuclear command control system and disable the enemy from launching a nuclear retaliation. So how do you measure, how do you quantify the impact of all these non-nuclear weapon systems on China's nuclear survivability? So it's very hard for the two sides to agree on the level of impact. And without that kind of agreement, it would be hard for them to agree how many additional nuclear warheads China may be justified to build in order to offset the additional threats from these non-nuclear weapon systems. So China is building up, believing that this is all, potentially about countering new American threats, but U.S. may very well see this as China pursuing an excessive nuclear capability for more aggressive purposes. So how to address the impact of new technologies? There is no readily available solution, even at the scholarly level. Experts have no good idea and good framework to incorporate non-nuclear technologies into the nuclear equation, into the strategic stability equation. And there is also this thinking that today the military competition between major powers has become a competition of military systems. It's no longer a competition of specific weapons. It's a competition of systems of weapons. Traditionally for a long time, China relied on asymmetric capabilities, asymmetric military employment strategies to counter a much stronger power. But today, I think there is this growing thinking in China that in the future, China has to engage in a much more comprehensive military competition with the United States. If China really wants to be able to address the American threat, it can no longer rely on an asymmetric strategy, because if you really want to acquire advantage, you have to have advantage across the systems. You cannot have shortcomings in major areas. You have to have strong capabilities in all the sectors. So I think that is moving China to invest more systematically across the board. And that makes arms control negotiation harder to take place, because traditionally it is the US that is investing in capabilities like missile defense, etc. And China wants the United States to reach an agreement to limit and control its missile defense development. But today, I think China itself is becoming increasingly interested in technologies like missile defense. Chinese experts, openly talk about the importance for China to develop and deploy a multi-layered missile defense system in the future. So even if the US is becoming more interested in negotiating missile defense limits, I'm not sure that China today would be as interested as before in discussing such limits, because China itself has a greater need to pursue those capabilities. And when it comes to new technologies, of course, it's really hard for China and the United States to agree on limiting emerging technologies whose military potential have now been fully understood. When people talk about hypersonics, unmanned systems, they can hardly agree on how to control and regulate, let alone limit the future development of these technologies, because they feel there may be so much potential and they should continue developing. Maybe they could achieve better outcome ahead of its adversary. And indeed, in the Chinese case, China managed to catch up with the United States and even exceeds and surpass the United States in certain areas. And China was the first in the world to deploy a land-based media-range hypersonic boost glider missile system. China was able to weaponize some of these technologies even faster than the United States. So that perceived capability to outcompete the United States in developing emerging technologies and making them and turning them into operational weapon systems is making arms control discussion really difficult to start. So I think all of that means this comprehensive military competition between the two sides is going to continue. And the ultimate restrictions, the ultimate obstacle, or the obstacle, or you may say the ultimate hope to control and to slow down this military competition really rests with the two countries' economic capability to continue funding their military development. Right now, I don't think the economic picture looks particularly promising. China has experienced a major slowdown in its economic growth. There are growing internal financial challenges and even crises, according to many experts. And with China's major demographic change in future years and decades, China may have to devote more resources to meet the growing need of the population. So if there is not enough money to fund technological development and better weapon and more weapon procurement, then I think that will have a major, increasingly important impact on the bilateral military competition. I think I'm also supposed to discuss the regional implications of the bilateral military competition. So maybe I should start with the scenario of Taiwan, which is increasing greater international attention with the planned visit by American House Speaker Nancy Pelosi that may happen in August. In recent years, the Taiwan issue is clearly becoming a major driving force behind the bilateral military tensions and military competition. The reason that for decades, US and China managed to maintain a relatively stable military relationship and managed to put nuclear weapons to the back burner of the bilateral military relationship is because there was no immediate prospect of military conflict between the two sides. But I think this situation is changing because Taiwan is quickly become an immediate concern that could lead to a direct military conflict. Especially in recent years, I think there is a higher sense of urgency on the Chinese side to resolve the Taiwan issue. Mr. Xi sees it is a good, it is a necessary component for achieving Chinese dream of national rejuvenation. And I think he has a personal interest in achieving unification to leave his mark on the Chinese history. So this greater sense of urgency has a very strong spillover impact on China's military thinking and planning, and also it has generated a lot of threat perception in Taiwan and in Washington. And for China, its conventional military power is growing very quickly in recent decades, and it's really narrowing the gap with the United States in the Asia-Pacific region. Maybe not necessarily at the global level, but certainly in the Asia-Pacific theater, and especially so within the first island chain. So China feels very, increasingly confident about its conventional capability vis-a-vis the United States. And as a result, I don't think China has a strong incentive to threaten nuclear escalation in a future conventional conflict. But the Chinese fear is that the US would be increasingly worried about China's conventional advantage in this region. And if the US faces a setback at the conventional military level in the future war with China, the US, the Chinese fear is the US may have a stronger incentive to go nuclear or to threaten using nuclear weapons first. So that means China has to have the capability to deter that or to respond in such a scenario. So that increases the incentive for China to develop so-called crisis management capability, right? Being able to respond in kind or in proportion to limited nuclear attacks from the United States. That may explain some of the very fast development of China's theater-range nuclear capabilities in recent years, including DF-21 and DF-26 missiles. And if both countries are now increasingly focusing on developing crisis management capabilities, I think that's a really bad news for nuclear stability, because it's very hard to control a competition when both sides are seeking crisis management capabilities vis-a-vis the other. North Korea is certainly another important region that will be directly affected by the US-China military competition. North Korea is clearly exploring the gap between US and China. And since 2018, when North Korea launched its Charm Offensive and sought talks with the United States, North Korea has made tremendous efforts to draw China closer to itself in order to provide in order to ensure that China can back North Korea up in its negotiations with the United States. And after the North Korea and US talks failed, North Korea faces continuous American economic pressure and political pressure. So it has even a stronger incentive to build a closer relationship with China. Internationally, we see North Korea making every effort to defend Chinese positions on issues like Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, etc. And the North Korea leader also issued very warmly worded messages of congratulation to Chinese leaders to commemorate their bilateral friendship treaty negotiation, and used opportunities as the important party Congress meetings to send very warm congratulation messages to each other. And as a result, I think we have seen the bilateral relationship reach a very high level, unprecedented in recent years. And as a result, it is increasingly unlikely that China will work with other major powers to punish North Korea, even if North Korea conducts more military provocations. We have seen China and Russia opposing US and other UN Security Council permanent members to issue additional economic sanctions after recent North Korean ICBM tests. And I think it's very likely that even if North Korea conducts a 7th nuclear test in the future, there will not be Chinese and Russian support for additional UN Security Council resolution against North Korea. So how to manage the North Korean nuclear issue without a strong Chinese and Russian support, without the major powers on the same page? I think that's a major challenge for regional security and stability. I think India is, of course, also affected by US-China competition. Although China still seeks to develop a long-term stable relationship with India, I think in the long run, India is likely to move closer and closer to Western countries because of its growing concern towards China, which will make it hard for China and India to maintain a positive relationship. And also under the current Chinese leadership, China really stresses the importance of protecting and defending territorial integrity at all costs. That makes it harder for China to improve relationship with India given their constant border dispute. So that will be even more important poisoning appeal in the bilateral relationship. In terms of U.S. allies in the region, I think we certainly will see a trend of strengthened American-led military alliance building in East Asia, and perhaps even involving countries far away like Australia. The new US efforts to build unilateral alliances like Quad is viewed with a great concern in Beijing, and China is making every effort to weaken or at least contain the impact of these new American unilateral alliances implications for China. And in this network, South Korea is viewed as the weakest link. So I think we will see more US-China competition to win, to influence the domestic debates in South Korea. So that will be, I think, important battlefield for US-China political influence competition. And after Ukraine war, it's, I think, reasonable to expect closer military cooperation between China and Russia. China would be in a weaker position vis-a-vis China and might be willing to provide even more advanced military technologies to China. So we are likely to see, I think, even a stronger cooperation between the two sides in the area of strategic military. They may conduct more joint patrols by bombers. There may be more cooperation on missile defense and early warning systems. So that's another, country I think will be affected by US-China competition, but I can only briefly discuss these issues given the time limit. I think I've been talking for more than 45 minutes now, so maybe I should stop here and welcome any comments or questions, feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tong, for a very wide-ranging discussion. And I think you have touched upon almost many of the important topics that perhaps were in the minds of the audience, as well as I was actually looking forward to hear your perspective on the growing US-China competition, not just in the region, but beyond, and its impact on the regional countries specifically. And I think you really, an important point that you highlighted was the nuclear element of that, and how China is kind of, getting, the pace in China is also increasing in terms of when it comes to the nuclear development, which previously was not to be seen. And I think that in terms of the technological development, not just the nuclear, but also in the emerging technologies as well. And I think this entire discussion becomes very much more important for Pakistan, essentially, because Pakistan is trying to balance its relationship between China and the US both, and where US is definitely is an important partner in a number of things, and China is the strategic partner, and the way US-China relationship, whichever shape it takes at the global front end and in the regional space, it has a direct bearing on Pakistan as well. So this is very important discussions and important points that you have raised. I'm sure it might have raised a number of questions in the minds of the participants, and so we open the discussion for we open the space for the discussion and the questions. If you have, you can raise your hand, and by raising your hand, and I'll go in the order of in which the hand has been raised, or you can write in the inbox directly to me. I'll indicate the question both ways. So we already have a couple of hands on. The first is Mr. Hassan Ahmed. Hassan Ahmed, please introduce yourself and ask your question, please.
Yes. Hello. I am Hassan Ahmed. I am a graduate of international relations, and my question is that considering all the facts that you have told us about, can the US-China relations currently, can they be termed as a Cold War? And if there is a Cold War, then how should the other countries should deal with it? Because, and if it is not a Cold War, then why it is not? So that's my question. Can it be termed as a Cold War? Thank you.
Sitara, do you want me to answer or do you want to collect more? I'm happy to do either.
What you prefer? Do you want one by one, or we can collect?
Yeah, I can answer one by one if you think that makes sense.
Sure.
Okay. Well, thank you for the question. Of course, whether we call it a new Cold War depends on how we define Cold War, and we can have a very long debate about the definition. One important similarity, I think, is there is growing ideological competition between the two sides. And Cold War, I think, built on a very intense ideological competition between the West and the Soviet blocs. And today, I think this ideological competition has become increasingly important and serious. And it directly affects how the two sides understand each other, understand the basic facts. So it directly contributes to the perception gap I mentioned, and it's making it very hard for the two sides to build common standings. With that kind of perception gap becoming wider and wider, I do worry that it could lead to a serious military conflict, either over Taiwan Strait or somewhere else, like in the South China Sea. So I think this is one similarity. Of course, a major difference is the economic interdependence today between China and the United States. That was, not the case during the Cold War. But even in that regard, I think the very serious threat perception between the two sides are really driving them to gradually decouple economically. China, of course, expressed its position of wanting to avoid economic decoupling because China has benefited tremendously from its economic and trading relationship with Western countries, and still has a strong interest in maintaining a substantial economic relationship. China needs access to Western technologies, investment, and market. This access will help ensure China's continuous growth and will help China to have a long-term competition with the US-led Western countries. But on the other hand, China is increasingly worried about Western countries' capability to impose crippling sanctions on countries like Russia and China. Right? China is watching during the Ukraine war, Western countries imposing very strong and comprehensive sanctions against Russia and really weakening Russia's economy, if not in the short term, but certainly in the long term. And the Chinese leader is deeply concerned about Western countries applying similar economic pressure on China in the future China-Western confrontation. So the leadership is really making efforts for China to develop self-sufficient capabilities and technologies. So in the future, China wouldn't be strangulated by Western countries in a crisis. So there's greater and greater emphasis on building self-sufficiency and becoming self-reliant in key areas of economy and technology. But with China emphasizing self-sufficiency and self-reliance, that will create concerns in Western countries, in the United States, that they could become unilaterally dependent on the Chinese supply chain. So that concern would drive the US and Western countries also slowly but incrementally and steadily moving away from the Chinese supply chain and become more independent. So despite the Chinese desire to preserve economic interdependency, I think the growing concern about sanctions and the associated political risks and domestic risks are actually moving countries like China to adopt policies that will promote economic decoupling in the long run. So I wonder how long this current interdependence can really sustain if they don't resolve or at least mitigate their political level disagreements and problems. The level of people-to-people exchange is another difference between today's situation and Cold War. But again, with bilateral tensions rising, the people-to-people exchange has also been seriously affected. And of course, today's much less exchange between the two sides is attributable to the COVID-19 pandemic. But a lot of the reduction in people-level exchanges is also due to political level rivalry, right? Including at the between the expert communities. Today, for a Chinese expert to have a meeting with a foreigner, not only in person, but even to attend a virtual meeting on the internet, he or she usually has to apply for official approval, and that could involve a very lengthy process. So it becomes increasingly difficult for the experts from the two sides to maintain contact and have frequent and free communications exchanges. And that also contributes to greater misunderstandings and suspicion. So if we look at all these factors, I worry that the two sides are moving increasingly closer to a situation that resembles the Cold War, even though right now we still have better, stronger economic relationship and people-to-people exchanges.
Thank you, Tong. I think you are very right in saying that perhaps slowly and steadily the situation is moving towards where it looks more like a Cold War. While one hoped that with President Biden coming to the office, situation would slightly get better, but I think those hopes were in a way destroyed when soon after the first interaction between the US, the Biden administration in Alaska at Anchorage didn't turn out well. And I think the recent exchanges at the Shangri-La dialogue also point at towards a situation where it's more looks like Cold War and less cooperative or less, less possibility of going towards any peaceful resolution of at least tactical issues, if not the strategic ones. So I move on to the next person who has raised their hand. It's Mr. Syed Imran Abbas. Abbas, Mr. Imran, you go first, please.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Zhao. I am Imran Abbas, Assistant Professor, Department of Politics and International Relations, University of Sargodha. Thank you, Dr. Zhao, for such a comprehensive presentation. My question is that since you mentioned that the available literature on the impact of emerging technologies on the nuclear doctrine and postures are not significant, don't you think that there should be a necessity to separate the nuclear postures with your conventional capabilities and the postures of the conventional military strength of US, China, and Russia at least, so that they can minus the possibility of a disarming strike and a bigger nuclear catastrophe? I remember that Mr. George Perkovich from Carnegie was advocate of this policy that US should change its nuclear doctrine to existential threat. So can these three countries can come to this consensus for having a rationality and sanity to prevail? And I have a second question, if I'm allowed.
If it's a brief and quickly, but
yes, sure.
I think there are more people in line.
Do you see that the China's A2AD capabilities and militarization of artificial island will eventually lead China to have a more elaborated military partnerships and the very structural partnership with other countries than North Korea, possibly Pakistan, Iran, Myanmar, or any other country? Thank you.
Let me
go ahead, please.
Let me make sure I understand your second question. So you're asking, as China possess greater A2AD capabilities, would that facilitate China development of closer?
China acquiring A2AD capabilities and then leading towards the militarization of the artificial island in South China Sea. What would be the next Chinese potential step? Going to a military partnership with other countries, having bases all around in other countries? Do you see a possibility like this? Alternatively, the Quad happening and US freedom of navigation, air sea battle concepts, and all these happening around China.
Well, let me try to address this question first, given that it seems more complex than the previous one. Well, I think China has an ambition to defend its expanding global economic interests. There are more Chinese investments, more Chinese personnel in many parts of the world, and China feels the need to be able to project power to distance far away from Chinese shore in order to protect these global economic interests. I think that's a major driver of China seeking military presence in other places and building logistical facilities, if not military bases. And China sees itself as a future international leader, and as such, it is only natural for China to follow the suit of the United States and to have overseas military footholds. The mainstream thinking is this is just what a major power does. It needs global military presence to protect its global interests. So it's no secret, I think, Chinese military experts publicly discuss the need for China to build more and more overseas presence, starting from logistical bases to perhaps more direct military bases. I'm not sure how much of that is driven by China's growing A2AD capabilities, which are primarily aimed at deterring and dissuading American or other external powers' interference in Chinese interests near the Chinese border. If China wants to be more deeply involved in other regional security issues, like in the Middle East or South Asia or Africa, or Latin America, China certainly has the option in theory to deploy such A2AD capabilities, missiles, etc., to those regions. But I think that's going to be it's not going to be a near-term development. China has certainly demonstrated a growing interest in playing a bigger role in resolving regional security problems in places like the Middle East and Africa. The Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi has openly proposed a Chinese process of multilateral regional security dialogue in the Gulf region. So if that interest continues to develop, we may see further thinking along the line of deploying Chinese military assets to those regions in the future. But again, I think that's not a near-term priority for China. As for your first question about whether US and China can separate their nuclear relationship from the broader conventional military competition, it's going to be hard, again, because of the political level rivalry. The two sides disagree about the risks from this nuclear conventional entanglement. China developed and deployed dual-capable missiles like DF-26, primarily due to economic and operational level reasons. I think China thinks it is just cheaper to have a dual-capable missile that can play either a nuclear or conventional role than to develop two separate systems. It also makes the logistics easier to handle. But over time, as the US-China tensions grow, I think China recognizes that this nuclear conventional entanglement may help deter the United States from launching conventional attacks on Chinese conventional military assets if the US is really worried about the escalation risks coming from entanglement. So this risk actually helps China in a military sense. So again, this goes back to the question of what causes the risk between the two sides. And China thinks it's the US aggressive military posture that is fundamentally driving the military risks. And maybe a higher level of risk at the technical level, such as the risk from entangled systems, could make the United States behave more carefully in dealing with China, could deter and dissuade the US military from taking certain aggressive actions. Then it will be in Chinese interest to maintain such risk, or even perhaps such risks should further grow to even better deter American aggression. So there are perception gap about who is the aggressor and whose behaviors are responsible for creating the risks in the first place. It's really making it hard for the two sides to agree on technical level risk reduction measures. And in this case, I don't think China has a lot of interest in addressing the nuclear conventional entanglement problem precisely because of this perception gap. So that's why we haven't seen a lot of official level discussion about separating nuclear from the conventional systems.
Thank you, Tong. I think I have a list of questions in the inbox as well, which the participants are directly sending to me. And there was this one question from Mr. Simran Ali, who was a research officer at Center for International Strategic Studies, Islamabad. His question was essentially what you just said about the possibility of sitting down and resolving their issues through dialogue, which you just referred that they understand the risks of the nuclear entanglement, and possibly there is anytime soon there is no possibility that there is a chance. So partially you addressed that. If you want to add something to that,
Yes, I think I made the main points, but I also want to add one minor point, which is there is still room for bilateral discussion. Yes, China is increasingly recognizing the deterrence value or military value provided by the entanglement issue. But I don't think China fully appreciates how high the inadvertent escalation risk is being created by entanglement. How serious the risk is. I don't think Chinese military strategists have conducted thorough studies to fully understand how things can go wrong in a crisis, to understand the various scenarios in which the United States might misinterpret Chinese moves in a crisis. For example, Chinese mobilization of dual-capable missile systems in a conventional conflict could be misinterpreted by the United States as Chinese preparation for using nuclear weapons. And that could make US more willing to consider a nuclear response, which is not in Chinese interest. And also, again, if US misinterprets Chinese moves in a conventional crisis, the American countermeasures could endanger Chinese interests as well. So it could be a lose-lose outcome. That type of discussion has not happened extensively in the Chinese expert community. So I think there is still room for bilateral discussion to help raise awareness and help build common standings about the potential pathways of escalation as a result of entangled systems and capabilities. If both sides can agree on how serious this risk is and how it might create problems not only for the United States, but also for China, I think that awareness would help China become more interested in discussing efforts to separate nuclear from conventional capabilities. So building common standing about the risk and the necessity to address the risk would be a first step to jumpstarting official level dialogues that can perhaps look at some of these deeper drivers of entanglement.
Thank you. Next in line is Mr. Shayan Hassan Jami. Shayan, please unmute yourself and briefly introduce and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. My name is Shayan Jami. I'm a master's student of strategic studies at Air University. First of all, thank you to Dr. Zhao for the very comprehensive talk. So you did partially answer my question when you talked about economic decoupling. But if we talk about technological decoupling, focusing on the hardware and software that is needed for military technologies by both the US and China, there is still a dependency between both states. So, sir, and former previous attempts to decouple, such as the trade war and other attempts, have failed more or less. So, could you talk a bit about why this decoupling process has not been possible, and in the future, is decoupling even realistic in today's globalized world?
yes, I think the technological decoupling is also already happening gradually, right? It's motivated by the same dynamic I described before. China certainly is waiting to maintain its access to Western technologies, but China is also worried about its such dependence on Western technology in the long run. So it's promoting self-sufficiency in key technological areas, right? There's this term called bottleneck, technological bottleneck. China needs to resolve these technological bottlenecks to reduce its strategic risk. So a lot of government investments and stipends to support the Chinese companies to develop these technologies, including in computer chip manufacturing and vehicles and airplanes, engines, nuclear reactor, nuclear power technologies, clean energy technologies, advanced communication systems. So in the long run, both sides, I think I'm using the Chinese thinking as example, but the same, very similar thinking also exists in the United States. So I think it will inevitably lead to gradual decoupling, even in the technological domain. Of course, people desire to maintain this linkage, but economic interests always make room for take secondary priority when compared to geopolitical interests. And this is driven by a geopolitical interest to become less reliant on each other. So companies certainly will suffer. The high-tech sectors will suffer. They won't be able to access as much as they would want Western technologies, but they have no choice. They have no say in this geopolitical competition. And in many areas, there is already this formation of separate technological ecosystem, right? Chinese high-tech companies, internet companies, social media companies, developing two separate systems for the Chinese market and for the overseas market. They run on different apps, different algorithms. They apply with different government regulations. They don't share data between the two separate systems. So even Chinese companies are recognizing this trend of moving towards two technological ecosystems. So I think this is going to continue in the future.
Thank you. Next in line is Ms. Aiza Azam. Aiza, are you there, or you want me to read your question that you have sent me separately? Okay.
I'll just go ahead and try, but if it cuts out, I've given you the question as well. Dr. Zhao, you've talked about how Beijing believes that the United States is working on driving a wedge between the CCP and the Chinese people. If this is the fear, then Chinese government policies that restrict freedom of interaction between the Chinese and the American people, whether they're experts or otherwise, or policies that restrict freedom of expression in general. So wouldn't this actually have the effect that the government fears? If that's the case, then what do you think is the thinking in Beijing behind pushing these restrictive policies?
I don't think China believes that its efforts to manage information access to, for Chinese people, its efforts to manage public opinion domestically contributes to the gap between the ruling party and the people. I think China, Beijing believes the only way to ensure the general public support the party, support the system, is better and stricter management of information access and better efforts to manage public opinion. So, to open up communication between the two peoples actually carries that a greater risk of Western influence on Chinese public opinion. It carries greater risk for certain part of the Chinese public becoming more and more willing to adopt Western systems in China. So in this regard, the Chinese thinking is, we need to manage that risk at the population level, but in order to strengthen China's capability to influence international opinion, in order to help build China's image internationally, what China should do, according to this line of thinking, is to encourage Chinese state media and to encourage government-affiliated experts to make their voice heard more often at the international stage. So they encourage state media workers, they encourage government-affiliated experts, think tanks, and research institutes, and other government-affiliated public opinion leaders to speak up at international fora, to increasingly using Western social media to make Chinese voice heard. So there are different levels of efforts to engage. So I'm not sure if I have explained my understanding of the Chinese thinking, but I think China is not really promoting, idea exchange at the population level. In fact, that is viewed as a real risk and needs to be better managed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zhao. There are two questions related with the Quad and AUKUS. The first is in the chat box. Basically, first is by Azam Khan, who is asking if AUKUS and Quad, since they are security arrangements and partnerships which pursue the same agenda of containing China in South China Sea and in Asia. And does the US withdrawal, I'm assuming he's referring to the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, was also the reason behind containing China? And the second question with regards to the impact of Quad is from Research Assistant National. No, sorry, there is, hold on, where did I miss the question? Yes, okay. From Mr. Jawad Ali Shahid, who is that as US has opted to contain Chinese influence in Asia Pacific by forming new security alliances, do you think China is also looking for the same model to compete with the US? Secondly, what would be your take on the future of Quad? Do you believe other countries such as South Korea would opt to join the alliance?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I get the last question about South Korea.
There is a possibility of Quad being expanded and the possibility of South Korea joining as the Quad member.
Okay.
What are the South Korea joining that?
Thank you. There are a lot of good questions. Whether the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan is seen by China as driven by an effort to contain China. I think, well, firstly, even from the American perspective, I think the Afghanistan withdrawal was partly aimed at helping the United States better able to push back against Chinese growing influence in the Asia-Pacific region. And the U.S. cannot spread its resources too widely and risks overreaching and overstretching. So, given their increasing emphasis on the Chinese threat, they have to prioritize, and they decide to make better use of their resources. So I think even the United States would agree it is at least partly related to their thinking about China. And certainly this is interpreted in Beijing as a major reason for the withdrawal. But I think on the other hand, it shows, many Chinese experts believe the withdrawal, especially the very messy withdrawal at the end of the process, indicates the declining American power. U.S., the messy withdrawal and the U.S. inability to maintain order in Afghanistan, and the fact that the United States has to leave the entire country to its former enemy and can do nothing about it, despite the Taliban control of the country and reinstating some previous policies. So that shows the increasing weakness of American global power. So that encourages some of the Chinese thinking that the U.S. is retrenching and is reducing its global commitments to its allies, which may create opportunity for China to expand its influence. Some Chinese experts even infer from the Afghanistan withdrawal that the U.S. will also not come to Taiwan's defense in a future conflict. They think Taiwan is also a peripheral interest for the United States at a certain level. So I think this contributes to the overall Chinese assessment that the East is rising and the West is declining. And this sentiment has been really popular in the Chinese policy community. It is, explicitly endorsed by Mr. Xi, and therefore thoroughly embraced by senior officials and senior experts. So this withdrawal affects Chinese assessments about the balance of power at the global level. But on the other hand, I think China feels a little bit alarmed that the US is now further prioritizing its resources towards containing China. I think China is also, further readjusting its own strategic priorities towards the East Asia and the West Pacific region. So it makes the bilateral competition in this theater much more intense. In terms of your second question of whether China would perhaps follow suit and build its own unilateral alliances, if that's the question. I think it's a little it's going to be hard. China has a traditional policy of non-alignment, partially due to its own bitter experience during the Cold War. China formed a very strong alliance relationship with Soviet Union, but their relationship fell off, and they became primary enemies with each other. So the previous experience of forming an alliance relationship give the Chinese leaders the lesson that they shouldn't do this in the future because it really constrains Chinese policy options. It could also drag China into unnecessary conflicts with additional countries. It makes better sense for China to maintain a balanced relationship with major state powers. And we have seen China sticking to this approach in its foreign policy. When it comes to the Middle East or other regions, China always wants to build balanced relations with all major stakeholders in that region, and not to have the rely to adopt a one-sided approach. I think even if China wants to build a multilateral alliance in the future, it doesn't have many good options. China doesn't have many friendly countries to ally with. Russia, Pakistan, North Korea, Iran. Yes, there are quite a few, but they are spread in different corners of the world, certainly in different strategic directions. In Northeast Asia, maybe it might make more sense for a trilateral alliance network with Russia and North Korea. But again, I think China sees a lot of risk of moving into this direction. North Korea likes to threaten military provocations. Now North Korea has nuclear weapons. It may bring too much risk for China by allying explicitly with North Korea. And Russia is now becoming an international pariah. Russia becomes more reliant on China. And the more hostile Russian-Western relationship may also create additional risk for China to be dragged into an unnecessary major power conflict. So for all these considerations, I don't see it as a near-term priority for China to develop multilateral alliance relationships. On the issue of South Korea, and I'm sorry, I forgot to answer the first question about AUKUS and Quad, but maybe that's not a question, that's just a comment. But in terms of whether South Korea will join Quad, I think South Korea has been really careful taking a balanced approach in simultaneously managing its relationship with US and China. South Korea still believes that it has very strong interest in maintaining a stable relationship with China, especially in the economic area. And even in security issues, South Korea needs Chinese support in dealing with North Korea's nuclear problems and in maintaining regional stability in general. And South Korea may not be able to afford an openly adversarial relationship with China, given how much damage China can do to South Korean security. So for all these major constraints, even for a conservative president like President Yoon, I don't think he will choose to openly develop a one-sided relationship with the United States, and joining Quad could certainly signal a move in that direction. The most I think South Korea will do is to develop some partnership programs and cooperations with Quad states. You know, there is this Quad Plus program that opens up opportunities for cooperation with South Korea on issues of supply chain security, global health management, counter climate change cooperation. You know, this recent effort by Quad states to develop better maritime security surveillance capabilities in the Indian Ocean may be of some interest to South Korea too. So in other words, I think South Korea will engage with Quad in areas that are not directly about security and military cooperation, but with a greater emphasis on non-security areas. I hope I addressed all the questions, but if I missed anyone, please feel free to let me know.
Yeah, no, whatever I indicated earlier you have. And there are more questions pouring in as a direct message to me from the participants, but first I'll give the floor to Faraz Haider, who is patiently waiting. Faraz, you can ask your question first.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Noor. So my name is Faraz. I'm a coordinator with Strafesia and an independent analyst. My question is, given China's growing naval capabilities, specifically in unmanned underwater vehicles, with it trying to develop and operationalize underwater bases for UUVs, and as well as its general increasing and improving naval fleet, do you think that China will be able to compete strategically, if not tactically, with the US in the Pacific in order to sort of protect whatever national interests it has in the Pacific Ocean? That's the question. Thank you, sir.
I think China has a strong confidence that it will be able to compete with the United States in the future in West Pacific. China is building its naval fleet at a much faster speed than the United States. China is able to simultaneously construct several major battleships, whereas the US shipbuilding capacity is lagging behind significantly. So China can introduce a large number of new naval assets very effectively and efficiently in the next few years, and therefore quickly shifting the overall balance of naval power in West Pacific, with China's building of additional aircraft carriers, nuclear attack submarines, and other large battleships. China is already conducting drills and exercises in West Pacific on a much more frequent basis. And if there's going to be with tensions built up over Taiwan Strait, there is increasing discussion of the need for China to send aircraft battle groups to the waters on the east of the Taiwan Island and into the West Pacific to confront American aircraft carrier battle groups. So there is certainly a growing confidence to change the NATO balance of power. How much role unmanned systems, especially unmanned underwater systems, might play in this game, in this competition, is uncertain. China is investing in this area and has making some progress, but there is not much openly, publicly available information for us to make a definitive comparison about the Chinese-American unmanned underwater capabilities to say, who has competitive advantage in the long run. I think US has also been making very impressive progress in this domain, sometimes leading the competition in developing and deploying advanced and massive unmanned naval systems. We haven't seen China being able to deploy similar systems, but maybe China has the potential to catch up soon. But the lack of public available information makes us unlikely to draw any conclusion about the competition in this field in particular.
Thank you. There are quite a few questions in the inbox as well, and we are left with about 20 minutes. So we can quickly, if you can quickly answer the remaining questions, that would be good. There is this one question from Ms. Itfa Khurshid, who is master's student at the Air University. And her question is, how do you see US-China competition in technological domain? Keeping in view the emerging technologies competition is intensifying with the passage of time. Who takes the lead in the emerging technologies between the US and China, in your view?
I'm not an economic expert, so I may not be able to draw a broad conclusion about the overall technological competition between the two sides. I tend to think that if this decoupling continues to develop, the US-led Western countries may have some better long-term advantage, simply because they have more, they have a more robust technological base. They can conduct extensive cooperation within their bloc. Many Western countries have unique advantages in certain areas, so they can, develop complementary cooperation with each other. Whereas in the Chinese case, it has fewer partners in terms of high technologies, and Russia is declining in general. So in the long run, it may not be in China's advantage. But in the near term, I think China has shown impressive progress in leading some technological developments, both in the civilian and the military domains. Some Chinese companies have been really competitive in telecommunication sector. And in the military domain, again, China made impressive progress on hypersonic missile capabilities and some counter space technologies. Even the Chinese president, Mr. Xi, publicly claimed that China is now a leading player in the world in hypersonic technology. Quantum communication, quantum science, and quantum computing may be another area in which China has some lead. But the question is how long China can sustain that edge. So I think there is a greater uncertainty about long-term competition.
All right. Then we have a question from Ms. Sara Nazir. She is asking that the growing competition of both superpowers tends to increase the tension between Pakistan and India. So how can Pakistan, India, and China try to arrange some kind of setup to reduce the tension in the region? Some trilateral risk reduction measures, possibility of that in between India, China, and Pakistan. Do you foresee that as possible?
I think firstly, there need to be interest in having a regional or trilateral discussion. So far, it's very hard to arrange that type of discussion, especially at the official level. There has been a lot of academic proposals for the three countries to at least discuss their nuclear relationship, because there is this so-called chain action among the three. US-China nuclear competition affects China's nuclear buildup, which affects India's nuclear development, which then affects Pakistan's security. So we have to address it as a whole process. But even there, given China's reluctance to recognize Indian nuclear status, there is very little political interest to have discussions on such topics. And I haven't seen much expert level discussion on broader regional security issues as well. Maybe because I'm not necessarily an expert on Southern Asian security, so I'm not aware of what is going on. But I think firstly is to build the appreciation of the need to have joint discussions. Also, I think China doesn't recognize that doesn't recognize its own influence in India's security policy, which again creates obstacle for discussion exchange. China basically attributes India's effort to develop military capabilities to India's hegemonic desire to become a regional leader. And China rejects the argument that China's own military capability or military posture has anything to do with India's military development. I think it's certainly possible that India has its own regional ambition, but we may also need to recognize the growing connection between the two countries' security policies as a first step to be willing to have discussions. I think if the three countries can have joint exchanges in a transparent way, it could help build confidence and reduce Indian concern about so-called secret China-Pakistani security cooperation. I think I agree with the necessity to discuss more, but the lack of will at the political and expert level to engage has been a constant obstacle.
And so there is another question from Mr. Hashim Kamal, and who is asking, he's an undergraduate student of international relations at National Defense University. And his question is, NATO declared China as a security challenge for the first time, and now it considered it as one of the strategic priority, considering its coercive policies against the Western Bloc. How would China counter it? Is China, if NATO considers China as a threat or as a challenge, what would be the China's reaction if this is what NATO has?
China is certainly very displeased by the identification of China as a systematic competitor. For China, it believes that the reason NATO is making this readjustment is very much because of the United States. China thinks it's the US that is lobbying its other NATO partners to pay more attention to China and to the Asia-Pacific region. It reinforces the Chinese belief that the US is the main problem and troublemaker. And of course, China will take measures, I believe, to counter the NATO's growing interest in the Asia-Pacific region by, for example, trying to develop separate relationships with other key NATO members, France and Germany, and perhaps Italy and others are viewed as having different views with the United States on the China threat. If China can develop tailored relationship with these countries and persuade them to engage with China in a more cooperative and constructive manner, perhaps that would reduce NATO's hostility towards China as a whole. Another concern is, NATO may want to send more military presence to this region. But I think that's a more long-term concern. And even if there are more NATO naval presence in South China Sea or Western Pacific, I think at the military level, China feels confident that its own military buildup will be able to address that. And if, I think the more imminent Chinese concern is that some Asian countries might want to follow the NATO suit and develop a NATO-like multilateral security alliance in East Asia. But that's not directly about a NATO threat. It's about how China could prevent US East Asian allies from developing closer security cooperation in a multilateral manner. In other words, I think the NATO threat is, again, a longer term concern for China and not a directly concern, especially after the Ukraine war. NATO countries probably wouldn't have more resources to really invest in the Asia-Pacific region, further reducing the Chinese concern about a near-term naval presence on Chinese doorstep.
Thank you for the answer. And I would add one more last question, which is again from Mr. Simran, and he's asking that after the prolonging stalemate of Russia war in Ukraine, there is a perception in the West and in the US specifically that they have overestimated the Russian military technology. Since many of the Chinese weapon systems are based on the Russian technology or are of Russian made, like S-400 air defense system, and most of the aircrafts and other weapons as well. How do you see the US will perceive the Chinese military capability in a future conflict over Taiwan? Is there these perceptions in the US already that they are perhaps also overestimating Chinese capability, not just?
I'm sorry, I think it's either my connection or your connection that is freezing.
I think Sitara lost her connection, but you got the question. I think the gist.
Okay. I think
am I audible now? Sorry, I think I got lost in between. I didn't.
Yeah, your voice is audible. Yeah, you are audible now. Yeah.
Okay, Tong, did you hear the question in its entirety, or do you want me to repeat it?
I think I hear, I may hear the majority, the major part of your question, but you also said something towards the end. If you want to quickly repeat, that would be helpful.
Yes, so basically the question is about how US and the Western world largely thinks that they had overestimated the Russian capability. And since Chinese weapon systems are also based on Russian technology or of Russian origin, so how do you think there is the possibility that US, is a thought process going on already in the West and the US that they are overestimating the Chinese capability as well?
Well, first thing I want to say that many Chinese military experts also think the Russian military capability as a whole has really deteriorated in recent years. And China's military capability is now much stronger at many levels than the Russian military. So at least from the Chinese perspective, the poor Russian military performance in Ukraine doesn't necessarily mean that China's military performance in the future conflict will also be poor. Second point is, I think from the Chinese perspective, the overall military performance depends on many more things than just military hardware. And one important reason that Russia failed to achieve its initial goal over Ukraine is that Russia, took an incremental approach to conduct its initial military operation. Sending its troops in an incremental way, it didn't really accumulate enough power to conduct a major strategic blow at the very beginning of the conflict by taking out all the important strategic military sites and basically destroy Ukraine's resolve to resist. I think that was viewed in Beijing as a major mistake by the Russian decision maker. If Russia chose a different strategy, by concentrating enough power at the beginning and release this power altogether to deal a major blow to the enemy, it would perhaps change the entire course of the war. Which means the implication for China is if China adopts the right strategy or the right tactic, it has a fair chance of achieving military success, even against powerful enemies like Taiwan and supported by the United States. Another thing is, as the Ukraine war evolves, I think people are drawing lessons differently over time. Yes, the Russian military didn't perform well at the beginning, but later on, their performance improved, and Russia managed to make some important military progress in eastern Ukraine in recent weeks. So in the long run, what lesson China and Western countries will draw from the Russian performance is to be decided. Some people would argue that, in fact, it shows that Russia can fight an effective long war of attrition. Right? Russia still has, Russia can make advantage of its bigger military power and a bigger military stockpile. And therefore, if the war turns into a prolonged conflict, Russia would have time to gradually play out its overall advantage vis-a-vis Ukraine, whereas Ukraine needs really substantial support from Western countries who over time probably won't be able to sustain such strong military support. So that could also give China confidence about a future war with the United States. So I think we are at the time, and I will stop here. Thank you so much for all the questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zhao. There are still a few more questions, but I think I'll apologize to people whose question could not be included because of the shortage of time. But I'll take this opportunity again to thank you for your very insightful remarks. And also to the audience who not only intently listened to the speech, but also did take part in this interactive session, which made it all the more interesting. With that, we conclude here this session, and over to you, Firas.